The boy hit the marble floor hard. The sharp sound echoed through the cavernous lobby of the cliffside resort, cutting through the low murmur of old money and clinking crystal. Before Harper could drop her leather clipboard, a man in a bespoke charcoal suit had already caught the child by the shoulders. The man did not scold the boy. He did not call for security. He simply froze, his hands gripping the child's small arms, his breath catching in his throat. Harper moved with the practiced, invisible speed of the service class. She stepped across the imported stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent 8 years building an impenetrable armor against this world, against the ultra-rich who treated Blackwood Bay as their personal playground. She reached them in seconds, her voice perfectly modulated, stripped of all panic. She looked down at her 8-year-old son. "Leo, apologize to the gentleman," she said, her tone carrying the quiet authority of a mother who could not afford a single mistake. The man in the charcoal suit slowly lifted his head. The breath left Harper's lungs. The polished, pristine lobby of the resort seemed to tilt on its axis. The smell of expensive cedar and sea salt suddenly felt suffocating. It was him. Vance knelt on the marble, completely paralyzed. He was a man who controlled boardrooms, a venture capitalist who dismantled corporations before breakfast. He was the heir to the Sterling Trust, a labyrinth of shadow investments and offshore accounts. He had lived his entire 40 years surrounded by fixers, sycophants, and lawyers. He never hesitated. He never lost his composure. But right now, Vance was staring at a ghost. He looked at the boy's face. He saw his own jawline. He saw his own dark, unruly hair. But most terrifying of all, he saw his own eyes. The boy possessed the exact same piercing, analytical stare that Vance saw in the mirror every morning. It was not a resemblance. It was a mirror. "I am sorry, sir," Harper said, her voice trembling for only a fraction of a second before the heavy iron of her professional armor slammed back into place. "My son lost his footing. It will not happen again." She reached out and pulled Leo behind her legs, shielding him from the man on the floor. Vance tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but the clipped, highly controlled corporate dialect that usually served as his weapon completely failed him. His mind, trained to process risk and calculate liabilities, was short-circuiting. He looked from the boy to the woman standing over him. Harper. Her name echoed in his mind, a relic from a life he thought had been buried under 9 years of silence and stone. She looked older, her features sharpened by exhaustion and the relentless coastal wind of Rhode Island, but her eyes held the same fierce, quiet fire he remembered from a dark boathouse during a violent storm. Harper did not wait for him to recover. She did not offer a smile. "Come along, Leo," she said, her voice a grounded, pragmatic New England cadence that left no room for argument. She turned and walked away, her hand gripping her son's shoulder, disappearing behind the heavy mahogany doors of the staff corridor. Vance remained kneeling on the floor of the lobby. The wealthy guests flowed around him, oblivious to the fact that the foundation of his reality had just been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. For the next 3 days, the atmosphere at the cliffside resort felt like a heavy storm rolling in off the Atlantic. The resort sat on a jagged cliff overlooking Blackwood Bay. It was a hyper-exclusive enclave where a single night cost more than a local resident made in 6 months. The architecture was a testament to Gilded Age excess. All cold stone, slate roofs, and sprawling manicured lawns. Down the hill lay the service town. It was a working-class community plagued by seasonal unemployment and the bone-deep exhaustion of serving the ultra-rich. The people down the hill were the invisible ghosts who maintained the pristine illusion of the wealthy. Harper was one of those ghosts. She was the lobby manager, a title that meant she absorbed the complaints, the arrogance, and the casual cruelty of billionaires with a polite, empty smile. She kept her head down. She calculated every expense. She protected her son with a fierce, quiet desperation. But now, the ghost from her past was sitting in her lobby. Vance did not approach her immediately. He did not cause a scene. Instead, he observed. He sat in the corner of the lounge, a glass of untouched scotch on the table beside him. He watched the way Harper moved through the room, putting out fires, managing the demanding guests, and deflecting the micromanagement of Fiona, the resort's perpetually anxious assistant manager. Vance watched Harper's armor. He saw how thick it was. He saw how much it cost her to wear it. But mostly, Vance watched the boy. Leo was a creature built purely of forward momentum. He did not behave like the children of the wealthy guests, who were often loud, entitled, and ignored by their nannies. Leo was quiet. He was observant. Vance watched from a distance as Leo stood on the terrace, talking to Jasper, the aging groundskeeper. The boy was explaining the aerodynamics of a seagull's wingspan. his small hands moving in precise, calculated gestures. Jasper listened with patient respect, leaning on his broom, treating the 8-year-old like an equal. Vance felt a strange, agonizing pressure in his chest. It was a feeling he had not experienced since he was a child himself. Wandering the monolithic, cold stone halls of his family's estate, it was the feeling of profound, suffocating isolation. He did the math in his head. Over and over again. 9 years ago, the stranded regatta, the sudden, violent squall that had forced them to take shelter in the old boathouse, the rain hammering against the wooden roof, the profound, unexplainable connection in the dark, and then, the morning, the frantic phone call, his father's massive stroke, the waiting private jet, the sudden departure that had severed the only real moment of peace Vance had ever known. He had tried to find her later. He had asked Silas, his family's impeccable, silver-haired estate manager, to locate the woman from the boathouse. Silas had returned weeks later with a polite, bureaucratic apology. The woman had moved on. She had left no forwarding address. She did not want to be found. Vance had accepted the lie. He had buried the memory under millions of dollars in venture capital and the cold, clinical management of the Sterling Trust. But the math did not lie. The boy was 8 years old. The tension finally snapped on the evening of the 4th day. Harper was in the service hallway behind the main kitchen, conducting a linen inventory. The air smelled of industrial bleach and the heavy, damp scent of the ocean seeping through the stone walls. She was counting heavy cotton sheets when the heavy metal door clicked shut. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. The air in the narrow corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harper kept her eyes on her clipboard. "Guests are not permitted in the service corridors, sir," she said, her voice flat and professional. "If you need fresh towels, I can have housekeeping send them to your suite." Vance stepped closer. His footsteps were completely silent on the concrete floor. "He has my eyes," Vance said. The words were spoken in a low, gravelly whisper, but they hit the concrete walls like a physical blow. Harper's hand tightened around her pen until her knuckles turned white. She did not turn around. She did not stop counting the linens. "I do not know what you are talking about, Mr. Sterling," she said. "Stop," Vance said, his voice cracking with a sudden raw desperation that stripped away his corporate polish. "Please, just stop." Harper finally turned to face him. She looked at the man who owned half the coastline. She looked at the bespoke suit, the expensive watch, the posture of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Then she looked at his eyes. They were red-rimmed. The cold, calculating venture capitalist was gone. In his place was a man standing on the edge of a terrifying precipice. "He is my son," Vance whispered. Harper felt the panic rising in her throat, tasting like copper and sea salt. She forced it down. She could not afford to break. If she broke, the Sterling Trust would swallow her whole. They would take her son. They would erase her. "You are mistaken," Harper said, her voice a weapon of pure ice. "My son's father died before he was born. You are a guest at this resort. You will return to the lobby, or I will call security and have you removed for harassing the staff." Vance stared at her. He saw the terror hiding just beneath the surface of her anger. He saw the mother protecting her child from a predator. He took a slow step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I am not going to hurt you, Harper," he said softly. "I am not going to take him away. But I am not leaving this town until you tell me the truth." He turned and walked out of the service corridor, leaving Harper alone in the damp, bleach-scented air. She leaned against the concrete wall, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her weight. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The past had finally caught up to her. That night, Harper barely slept. She lay in the small bedroom of her rented duplex, listening to the wind howl off Blackwood Bay. The old house creaked and groaned, protesting the bitter cold of the Rhode Island winter. In the next room, Leo was sleeping soundly, his breathing slow and even. Harper stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through 1,000 different disaster scenarios. She knew how men like Vance operated. She knew about the Sterling Trust. She knew that billionaires did not ask for permission. They simply took what they wanted, and they used armies of lawyers to justify the theft. She had to protect Leo. She had to maintain the boundary. At 5 a.m, the alarm clock buzzed. Harper dragged herself out of bed, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She dressed in the dark, pulling on her heavy wool coat and wrapping a thick scarf around her neck. She kissed Leo on the forehead, leaving him in the care of Clara, her 60-year-old neighbor. Clara was a former constitutional law professor, a fierce, discerning woman who was completely unfazed by wealth or intimidation. She was the only person in Blackwood Bay who knew the truth about Leo's father. Harper stepped out into the freezing pre-dawn air. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Frost coated the windshield of her 10-year-old sedan, glittering under the pale yellow light of the street lamp. She walked across the cracked asphalt of the employee parking lot, her breath pluming in the cold air. She reached into her pocket for her keys. "I need 5 minutes." Harper jumped, dropping her keys onto the frozen ground. Vance stepped out from the shadows of the maintenance shed. He was wearing a heavy wool overcoat, his collar turned up against the biting wind. He looked as though he had not slept in days. Harper bent down, snatched her keys from the asphalt, and unlocked her car door. "I told you to stay away from me," she said, her voice tight with anger. Vance stepped forward, placing his hand flat against the driver's side window, preventing her from opening the door. "5 minutes, Harper," he said, his voice dropping to that chilling, gravelly whisper. "Then I will walk away. I swear to you." Harper looked at his hand pressing against the glass. She looked at the desperation in his eyes. She knew she could scream. She knew she could run. But she also knew that running from a man like Vance Sterling was a mathematical impossibility. She took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest to ward off the cold. "You have 3 minutes," she said. "Speak." Vance lowered his hand. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of 9 stolen years. Harper let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of humor. "Why didn't I tell you?" she repeated, her coastal accent thickening with raw, unfiltered anger. "Are you out of your mind?" "I had a right to know," Vance said, his corporate dialect returning, sharp and precise. "He is my son. I had a right to know he existed." Harper stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The professional armor was gone. The polite lobby manager was dead. In her place stood a mother who had survived on food stamps and sheer willpower, while the man standing in front of her slept in silk sheets. "Do not stand there in your $5,000 coat and lecture me about rights," she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage she had suppressed for nearly a decade. "I tried to tell you." Vance frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What do you mean you tried?" he asked. Harper stared at him, searching his face for the lie. She was an expert at reading the wealthy. She knew when they were deflecting. She knew when they were playing games. But Vance looked completely, utterly lost. "I sent a letter," Harper said slowly, watching his eyes. 2 months after the storm. When I realized I was pregnant, I sent it to the estate in Rhode Island. Vance shook his head, a slow, mechanical movement. "I never received a letter," he said. Harper's eyes narrowed. "I waited 6 months," she continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I was terrified. I was alone. I was working 3 jobs just to afford prenatal vitamins. When Leo was born, I took a photograph of him. He was 8 months old. He had your eyes. I put the photograph in an envelope. I wrote a second letter. I sent it via certified mail to the Sterling Trust headquarters in New York." Vance stopped breathing. The freezing wind whipped around them, tearing at their coats. But Vance did not feel the cold. He felt a sudden, terrifying numbness spreading through his chest. "Someone signed for it," Harper said, her voice breaking for the first time. "I tracked the receipt. Someone signed for the envelope. And then, nothing. Just silence. You ignored us. You threw us away." Vance stared at the frost on the asphalt. His mind was racing, pulling up files, dates, and protocols from 9 years ago. He remembered the chaos following his father's stroke. He remembered the transition of power within the Sterling Trust. He remembered the endless meetings, the legal battles, the absolute lockdown of his personal life. And he remembered the man who controlled the lockdown, Silas, the impeccable estate manager. Silas, the man who handled all the mail, all the security, all the access to the Sterling family. Silas, who had politely informed Vance that the woman from the boathouse had moved on and did not want to be found. Vance slowly raised his eyes to meet Harper's. The confusion was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. "I never received the letters," Vance whispered, his voice vibrating with a suppressed, violent anger. "I never saw the photograph." Harper stared at him. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a sudden, chilling realization. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't lying. He hadn't abandoned them. He had been managed. "Who signed for the envelope?" Vance asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Harper swallowed hard. "The signature was illegible," she said. "But the printed name on the return receipt was Warren Silas." Vance closed his eyes. The monolithic structure of his life was collapsing around him. For 9 years, he had believed that his isolation was a tragedy of timing. He had believed that the universe had simply pulled them apart, but it wasn't the universe. It was Silas. His trusted estate manager had intercepted the letters. Silas had looked at a photograph of an 8-month-old boy, recognized the heir to the Sterling Trust, and quietly disposed of the evidence. Silas had played God with Vance's life, keeping him isolated, keeping him unattached, keeping him perfectly positioned for the corporate machine. This was no longer a tragedy. It was a calculated corporate crime. Vance closed his eyes. The monolithic structure of his life was collapsing around him. For 9 years, he had believed that his isolation was a tragedy of timing. He had believed that the universe had simply pulled them apart, but it wasn't the universe. It was Silas. His trusted estate manager had intercepted the letters. Silas had looked at a photograph of an 8-month-old boy, recognized the heir to the Sterling Trust, and quietly disposed of the evidence. Silas had played God with Vance's life, keeping him isolated, keeping him unattached, keeping him perfectly positioned for the corporate machine. This was no longer a tragedy. It was a calculated corporate crime. Vance opened his eyes. The freezing wind of the Rhode Island morning whipped across the cracked asphalt of the employee parking lot, but he did not feel the cold. He looked at Harper. She was watching him, her breath pluming in the pale, bruised light of dawn. She was waiting for the billionaire to break, waiting for the polished venture capitalist to deny the ugly reality of his own empire. He did not break. He simply nodded. A slow, mechanical movement. "We cannot talk here," Vance said. His voice was stripped of all emotion, reduced to pure, tactical calculation. "Name a place. Somewhere off the resort property. Somewhere Silas does not know." Harper studied his face. She saw the immediate shift. The desperate man who had been pleading with her 5 minutes ago was gone. In his place was the heir to the Sterling Trust, the man who dismantled rival corporations before his morning coffee. "Rusty's," Harper said, her coastal accent sharp and guarded. "Route 1. 30 minutes. She turned, got into her 10-year-old sedan, and turned the key. The engine ground heavily before it finally caught, a harsh, rattling sound in the quiet morning. Vance watched her drive away, his mind already mapping the battlefield, calculating the liabilities, and preparing for a war he had not known he was fighting. Rusty's Diner was a relic of a forgotten Blackwood Bay. It sat on the edge of the coastal highway, a faded chrome box surrounded by rusted pickup trucks and salt-stained work vans. It smelled of old frying oil, burnt black coffee, and damp wool. It was a place. Vance walked through the heavy glass door. His bespoke charcoal overcoat immediately drew the eyes of the 3 fishermen sitting at the counter. He ignored them. He moved with a quiet, imposing authority, sliding into a cracked red vinyl booth across from Harper. She had a thick ceramic mug of black coffee in front of her. She did not offer him one. She sat with her heavy canvas tote bag pulled tight against her side, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the parking lot through the grease-stained window. "I want a DNA test," Vance said. His voice was low, barely carrying over the hum of the ancient refrigerator behind the counter. Harper did not flinch. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, sealed plastic cylinder. She placed it on the scratched Formica table, right next to the sugar dispenser. "I bought it at the pharmacy on the way here," Harper said. "Swab the inside of your cheek. I will do the same for Leo when I pick him up from school. I will mail it myself. You do not touch the samples. You do not control the laboratory." Vance looked at the plastic tube. It was a $20 kit from a strip mall. It was the key to a multi-billion-dollar dynasty. "Agreed," Vance said. He picked up the kit, broke the paper seal, and followed the instructions with clinical precision. He placed the swab back into the tube, sealed it, and slid it across the table. Harper put it back into her bag, zipping it shut with a sharp, final sound. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. The exhaustion in her face was entirely eclipsed by the fierce, quiet fire of a mother protecting her child. "Now you listen to me," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce register. "You do not go near my son. You do not speak to him. You do not look at him. Until we have the results, and until you prove to me that your people are not going to destroy our lives. You are a ghost." Vance held her gaze. He saw the absolute terror hiding just behind her anger. He knew exactly what the Sterling Trust was capable of. He knew that if Silas realized the secret was out, the corporate machine would move to crush Harper into dust. They would bury her in litigation, freeze her meager bank accounts, and drag her name through the mud until she surrendered the boy. I will not disrupt his life, Vance said, his tone carrying a heavy, unyielding authority. But you need to understand something, Harper. If that test comes back positive, he is not just your son anymore. He is my blood, and I will burn my own house to the ground before I let anyone touch him. Harper stared at him. For the first time in 9 years, she saw the man from the boathouse. The man who had listened to her in the dark. The man who had understood her without asking a single question. She stood up, leaving a crumpled $5 bill on the table. We will know in 48 hours, she said. She walked out of the diner, leaving Vance alone in the booth, listening to the wind rattle the cheap glass windows. The next 2 days were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. Harper returned to the cliffside resort. She put on her polite, empty smile. She managed the lobby, deflecting the complaints of the ultra-rich, nodding respectfully at Fiona, the assistant manager, who hovered over her shoulder with a clipboard, complaining about the thread count of the new pool towels. Every time the heavy mahogany doors of the lobby opened, Harper's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected to see a team of corporate lawyers walking in to take her son. She expected to see Silas, with his polite smile and hollow eyes, handing her a court order. She worked double shifts just to keep her mind occupied, but the terror was a constant, suffocating weight in her chest. Vance remained in his penthouse suite. He did not go down to the lobby. He did not attend his scheduled video conferences with the Wall Street trustees. He sat in the dark, watching the slate-gray ocean crash against the jagged cliffs below. He thought about Silas. He thought about the silver-haired man who had practically raised him after his father's stroke. Silas had taught him how to tie a Windsor knot. Silas had taught him how to read a balance sheet. Silas had also looked him in the eye and told him that the woman he loved had vanished without a trace. The betrayal was a slow-acting poison, burning through Vance's veins. He spent hours pacing the hardwood floor, piecing together the timeline. He realized how carefully his life had been curated. Every relationship he had attempted over the last decade had been subtly undermined or politely discouraged by the estate manager. Silas had built a pristine, invisible cage around him, ensuring that the principal heir to the Sterling Trust remained entirely focused on the accumulation of wealth. On the morning of the third day, the email arrived. Harper was in the employee break room, staring at her phone. The screen glowed in the dim fluorescent light. The subject line was a string of automated numbers from the independent laboratory in Boston. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped the device. She took a deep breath, smelling the stale coffee and industrial cleaner of the break room, and tapped the screen. The document loaded slowly. Probability of paternity, 99.8%. Harper closed her eyes. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek, cutting through the light makeup she wore for the guests. It was not a tear of sadness. It was the terrifying release of a secret she had carried alone for 8 long years. The theoretical had just become agonizingly real. The boy with the sharp, analytical curiosity and the piercing stare officially belonged to the most powerful family in New England. 3 floors above her, Vance was staring at the exact same document on his laptop. 99.8%. He did not cry. He did not move. He simply stared at the numbers until they burned into his retinas. He had a son. He had an 8-year-old boy who understood aerodynamics and argued like a lawyer. He had a family. And Silas had stolen them from him. Vance closed the laptop. The quiet, melancholic man who had checked into the resort a week ago was dead. The man who stood up from the desk was a predator, cold, absolute, and ready to dismantle the cage he had been living in. At 5 in the evening, Harper's shift ended. She changed out of her uniform, wrapping her heavy wool coat tightly around her body. The sun had already set, plunging Blackwood Bay into a bitter, freezing darkness. She walked out the back exit, heading toward the employee parking lot. The wind howled off the water, biting at her exposed skin, carrying the smell of salt and impending snow. She reached her car and dug her keys out of her pocket. "Good evening, Miss Marin." Harper froze. The voice was smooth, polite, and completely out of place in the cracked asphalt lot. She turned around. Standing under the flickering yellow light of a street lamp was a man in an impeccable camel hair overcoat. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the wind. He held a leather briefcase in one gloved hand. Harper recognized him immediately. She had seen him walking through the lobby years ago, trailing behind Vance's father like a well-dressed shadow. Silas. Harper did not speak. She gripped her keys, sliding the longest one between her knuckles. It was a pathetic weapon against a man who commanded billions of dollars, but it was all she had. "I apologize for startling you," Silas said, his voice a masterclass in bureaucratic calm. I am Warren Silas. I manage the affairs of the Sterling family. I know who you are, Harper said, her coastal cadence flat and guarded. What do you want? Silas offered a small, sympathetic smile. It did not reach his eyes. His eyes were completely hollow, devoid of any human warmth. I am here out of concern, Miss Marin, Silas said, taking a slow step forward. Mr. Sterling has been acting quite erratically over the past few days. He has missed several critical board meetings. He has isolated himself in his suite. We are deeply worried about his mental health. Harper stared at him. She saw the trap immediately. Silas was laying the groundwork. He was framing Vance as unstable, building a narrative that would discredit anything Vance said or did. That sounds like a corporate problem, Harper said, keeping her distance. I am a lobby manager. I do not manage your boss. Silas chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves on pavement. Indeed, he said. But you see, Mr. Sterling has a history of fixations. When he is under immense stress, he sometimes latches onto things. Or people. He creates delusions to cope with the pressure of his responsibilities. Silas took another step closer. The smell of expensive cologne and peppermint masked the scent of the ocean. It has come to my attention that he has developed a sudden interest in you, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a polite, chilling whisper. And perhaps, in your young son. Harper's blood ran cold. She forced herself not to look away. She forced herself not to show the absolute terror gripping her chest. I do not know what you are talking about, she said. Silas sighed, adjusting his leather gloves with meticulous care. Miss Marin, you are a single mother. You work very hard to provide a modest life for your boy. It would be a terrible tragedy if Mr. Sterling's delusions were to disrupt that life. The Sterling Trust is a very large, very protective entity. When it perceives a threat to its principal members, it reacts aggressively. It employs teams of private investigators. It scrutinizes tax records, custody arrangements, and moral character. It can make a person's life incredibly difficult. He was threatening to take Leo. He was doing it with a polite smile and perfect grammar. Are you threatening me? Harper asked, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Silas looked genuinely offended. Heavens. No, he said softly. I am offering you a warning. Mr. Sterling is unwell. If he approaches you with wild claims, or if he suggests some sort of permanent arrangement, I strongly advise you to ignore him. For your son's sake, do not engage. Do not make claims, because if you do, the trust will have no choice but to protect itself, and we have never lost a battle of attrition. Silas gave a slight, formal bow. Have a pleasant evening, Miss Marin. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of a waiting Blacktown car that had been idling silently at the edge of the lot. Harper stood frozen by her car, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The armor she had worn for 8 years was cracking. The monster was no longer hiding in the dark. It was standing in the parking lot, smiling at her. She threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door. She locked it with a violent punch to the button. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unlock her phone. She dialed the number Vance had given her at the diner. He answered on the first ring. Yes, Vance said. He was here. Harper breathed, the panic finally bleeding into her voice, shattering her pragmatic facade. Silas. He was waiting by my car. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For 3 seconds, Vance did not breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was a terrifying mechanical whisper. What did he say to you? He said you were unstable, Harper said, the words tumbling out in a rush. He said you have delusions. He threatened me, Vance. He said if I make any claims, the trust will investigate my custody. He is going to take Leo. Listen to me, Vance said, his voice cutting through her panic like a scalpel. Where is Leo right now? He is at Clara's house, Harper said. My neighbor. Keep him there, Vance ordered. Do not go back to your apartment. Silas will have people watching it. Go straight to Clara's. Lock the doors. Do not let anyone inside unless it is me. What are you going to do? Harper asked, her voice trembling. I am going to dismantle him, Vance said. The line went dead. Harper dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. She jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. She tore out of the parking lot, her tires squealing against the freezing asphalt. She drove through the winding, dark streets of the service town, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights felt like a threat. Every shadow looked like a Blacktown car. She pulled into Clara's driveway. The small, weathered house was dark, save for a single reading light in the front window. Harper ran up the wooden steps and pounded on the door. Clara opened it immediately. The 60-year-old former constitutional law professor was wearing a thick cardigan, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot. She took one look at Harper's face and stepped aside. "Get in," Clara said, her voice sharp and discerning. Harper practically fell into the hallway. She locked the deadbolt behind her, leaning against the heavy oak door, gasping for air. "Where is he?" Harper asked. "Asleep on the couch," Clara said, pointing toward the living room. "He was reading a book on bridge engineering and passed out." "What happened, Harper?" Harper looked at the older woman. Clara was the only person who knew the truth. She was the only one who knew about the boathouse, the letters, and the silence. She was fiercely protective and completely unfazed by wealth or intimidation. "They know," Harper whispered. "The man who kept the letters. He found me. He threatened to take Leo." Clara's eyes narrowed. The grandmotherly demeanor vanished, replaced instantly by the fierce, calculating intellect of a legal scholar. "Did he put it in writing?" Clara asked. "No," Harper said. "Just a conversation in the parking lot." "Classic intimidation," Clara muttered, walking toward the kitchen. "He has no legal standing to take your child without a court order, and he cannot get a court order without proving you are unfit. He is trying to panic you into making a mistake." Clara pulled a heavy cast-iron kettle from the stove and began filling it with water. "Where is the father?" Clara asked, not looking back. "He is handling it," Harper said. Clara turned off the faucet. She looked at Harper, her expression unreadable. "Let us hope he is as ruthless as his reputation suggests," Clara said, "because men like Warren Silas do not stop until they are destroyed." Vance drove his rented SUV along the jagged coastline of Rhode Island. The heater was blasting, but he felt nothing but cold, absolute focus. He was heading toward the estate. His family's mansion sat on a massive cliff, overlooking the Atlantic. It was a monolithic, cold stone structure that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. It was where his father had died. It was where Silas maintained his office, the nerve center of the Sterling Trust's domestic operations. Vance pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates. He punched in his personal access code. The heavy metal doors swung open silently, granting the master of the house entry into his own prison. He drove up the winding gravel driveway. The mansion was completely dark. Silas lived in a separate carriage house on the property, but Vance knew the estate manager kept his most sensitive files in the main house, locked inside a reinforced steel room that used to be a wine cellar. Vance parked the car and walked up the sweeping stone steps. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the cavernous foyer. The air smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and dust. He did not turn on the lights. He moved through the dark halls using the moonlight filtering through the massive arched windows. He knew every inch of this house. He had spent his childhood hiding in its shadows, listening to the echoes of corporate negotiations and hollow dinner parties. He reached the basement door. He walked down the stone steps, his leather shoes making no sound on the cold granite. He stood in front of the heavy steel door of Silas's office. It required a biometric scan and a keypad code. Vance was the principal heir. He owned the house. He owned the door. He placed his thumb on the scanner and punched in the master override code he had memorized 10 years ago. The lock clicked. The heavy door swung open. Vance stepped inside and turned on the small desk lamp. The room was windowless, lined with locked, fireproof filing cabinets. In the center sat a massive mahogany desk, perfectly organized. Silas was a man who believed that documentation was protection. He kept records of everything. It was his greatest strength, and Vance knew it would be his fatal weakness. Vance walked over to the primary filing cabinet. It was secured with a heavy, old-fashioned brass padlock. Silas did not trust digital encryption for his true secrets. He trusted metal. Vance picked up a heavy bronze paperweight from the desk. He wrapped his wool scarf around it to muffle the sound. He raised his arm and brought the bronze weight down on the brass padlock with terrifying, violent force. The metal cracked. He hit it again. And again. The sound echoed in the small, concrete room, a rhythmic, brutal hammering that mirrored the pounding of his own heart. On the fourth strike, the padlock shattered. Vance threw the broken metal to the floor. He pulled open the heavy steel drawer. It was filled with thick, leather-bound ledgers. Silas's handwritten accounts. Vance pulled the most recent ledger from the drawer and carried it to the desk. He opened it under the harsh light of the lamp. He began to read. In a masterclass of tension, Vance's eyes scanned the perfectly formed, bureaucratic handwriting. He bypassed the standard estate expenses. The landscaping, the property taxes, the staff salaries. He was looking for the anomalies. He was looking for the shadow money. He found it on page 42. A recurring line item buried under the heading of consulting and security retainers. $40,000. Paid annually. Vance traced the line with his finger. The payments began exactly 9 years ago. The exact same month his father had suffered the stroke. The exact same month Harper had sent the first letter. He flipped back through the pages, his mind processing the financial data with lethal speed. The payments were routed through a shell company in Delaware, then transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Silas was not just hiding a child, he was being paid to do it. Vance's mind raced. Silas was a wealthy man, but he was an employee. He did not have the authority to authorize $40,000 shadow payments from the trust's discretionary funds. Only one person had that kind of unilateral financial power. Montgomery. Fenwick Montgomery, the senior trustee, an untouchable Wall Street aristocrat who had controlled the Sterling Trust's investments for 2 decades. Vance stared at the ledger. The pieces were snapping together with sickening clarity. Montgomery was using Silas to keep Vance unattached, isolated, and distracted. But why? A child would have changed the line of succession. A child would have triggered a mandatory independent audit of the trust's discretionary funds to establish a new generational trust. Montgomery was terrified of an audit. Vance closed the ledger. His breathing was slow, heavy, and dangerous. He walked back to the filing cabinet and pulled open the second drawer. This one contained personal files, medical records, background checks on potential business partners, non-disclosure agreements signed by former staff. Vance flipped through the thick hanging folders until he found one labeled with a single, typed word. Marin, Harper's maiden name. Vance pulled the manila folder from the drawer. His hands, which had remained perfectly steady while breaking the lock, were suddenly trembling. He carried the folder to the desk. He sat down in Silas's leather chair. He opened the cover. Inside, pinned to the left side of the folder, were 2 envelopes. They were yellowed with age. The return address was a small apartment in Blackwood Bay. The certified mail receipt was stapled to the front, bearing Silas's elegant, illegible signature. Vance did not open the letters. He could not bear to read the desperate words of a terrified, isolated young woman begging for help from a man who never knew she was calling. He looked at the right side of the folder. There was a single, glossy photograph. It was a picture of an 8-month-old boy. He was sitting on a faded blanket, looking up at the camera. He had dark, unruly hair. He had Vance's jawline. He had Vance's exact, piercing stare. Beneath the photograph, Silas had attached a small, typed label, retained for future disposition. Vance stared at the label, the clinical, bureaucratic language, the absolute sociopathic detachment. Silas had looked at a living, breathing child, the heir to the Sterling family, and reduced him to a piece of leverage, a liability to be managed. The psychological dam inside Vance's mind finally broke. The grief for the 9 stolen years, the rage at the betrayal, the profound, crushing guilt of leaving Harper alone in the dark. It all shattered the frozen exterior he had maintained for his entire adult life. He pressed his hand over his mouth, a raw, ragged sound tearing its way out of his throat. He sat in the dark basement of his empty ancestral home, staring at the face of the son he had never known, and he wept. He wept for the boy in the photograph. He wept for the woman who had mailed it. When the tears finally stopped, the silence in the room was absolute. Vance slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the photograph. He realized the terrifying scope of the conspiracy. This was not just about an overprotective estate manager hiding a scandal. This was a massive, systemic financial cover-up. Silas was not acting alone. Montgomery, the untouchable Wall Street aristocrat, was paying Silas to keep Vance isolated. They were bleeding the trust dry, and they had erased a child to do it. Vance picked up the photograph of his son. He placed it carefully inside his coat pocket, right over his heart. He stood up from the desk. The grief was gone. What remained was a cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless determination. Silas and Montgomery thought they were managing a liability. They did not realize they had just started a war. He walked out of the reinforced steel room, leaving the shattered brass padlock on the floor. Vance did not bother to turn off the small desk lamp. He left the heavy steel door wide open, a glaring, undeniable signal to Silas that the sanctuary had been breached. He moved through the cavernous, dark halls of his ancestral home with long, purposeful strides. The air inside the mansion felt different now. It no longer felt like a museum or a mausoleum. It felt like a crime scene. He pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the freezing Rhode Island night. The wind howling off Blackwood Bay tore at his wool overcoat, but the bitter cold barely registered against the burning clarity in his mind. He climbed into the driver's seat of his rented SUV and slammed the door, sealing himself inside the quiet, leather-lined cabin. He did not start the engine immediately. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. The digital clock read 11:45 in the evening. He dialed a number he had only used in times of absolute corporate warfare. It rang twice before the line clicked open. "Speak," the voice on the other end said. It was Beatrice. She was Vance's personal attorney, a 53-year-old woman with short silver hair and zero patience for foolishness. She did not operate on normal human hours. She operated on the relentless, unforgiving schedule of global markets and high-stakes litigation. She was the only person in the world who spoke to Vance as an equal, and she possessed a legal mind of lethal precision. "I am at the Rhode Island estate," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated with suppressed violence. "I just broke into Silas's private filing room." There was a brief pause on the line. The sound of a pen tapping against a glass desk echoed through the speaker. "Breaking and entering into your own property is a fascinating legal gray area," Beatrice said, her tone perfectly flat. "I assume you have a reason for destroying your estate manager's privacy at midnight." "I found the shadow ledgers," Vance said. The tapping of the pen stopped instantly. "Explain," Beatrice commanded. Vance kept his eyes on the dark, winding driveway ahead of him. He recounted everything. He told her about the boy in the lobby of the Cliffside Resort. He told her about the letters Harper had sent 9 years ago. He told her about the intercepted photograph, the illegible signature on the certified mail receipt, and the terrifying clinical label Silas had typed beneath the face of his 8-month-old son. Beatrice did not interrupt. She listened with the cold, calculating silence of a predator assessing a wounded target. Then, Vance delivered the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. "Silas is receiving $40,000 a year from a Delaware shell company," Vance said. The payments began exactly 9 months after the storm. Exactly when Harper would have realized she was pregnant. The money is being routed to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The silence on the line stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. When Beatrice finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual dry sarcasm. It was sharp, focused, and entirely devoid of mercy. "Silas does not have the authority to authorize discretionary payouts of that size," Beatrice said. "I know," Vance replied. "Only the senior trustee can move that kind of capital without triggering an internal review," she continued, her mind already racing ahead of the evidence. "Fenwick Montgomery." Vance gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Why, Beatrice?" Vance asked, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Why would Montgomery pay my estate manager to hide my own child from me?" "Because of the succession clause in the Sterling Trust Charter," Beatrice said, her words clipping together with rapid-fire precision. "Vance, think about the legal mechanics of your family's wealth. You are the principal heir, but you are unmarried and, until today, presumed childless. Under the current structure, Montgomery has almost unilateral control over the discretionary investment funds." Vance closed his eyes. The corporate logic was snapping into place, cold and undeniable. "If you acknowledge a biological child," Beatrice continued, "the charter mandates the immediate creation of a generational trust. That process requires a mandatory, independent federal audit of all discretionary accounts to ensure the child's financial future is secure." "Montgomery is terrified of an audit," Vance whispered. "Exactly," Beatrice said. "If Montgomery is paying Silas to keep you isolated, it means he is hiding something massive in those discretionary accounts. He is bleeding the trust dry, Vance. He has been doing it for years. A child would have brought the federal auditors right to his doorstep." "How much?" Vance asked. "I will not know until I get inside the accounts," Beatrice said. "But men like Fenwick Montgomery do not risk federal prison for a few $100,000. We are likely looking at tens of millions." Vance opened his eyes. He looked at the monolithic stone mansion looming in the darkness. His entire life had been a carefully constructed lie, designed to protect a Wall Street aristocrat's embezzlement scheme. They had stolen 9 years of his life. They had forced Harper to raise their son in poverty, working grueling shifts at a luxury resort, terrified of the very people who should have been protecting her. "They reduced my son to a liability," Vance said, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical weight in his chest. Beatrice heard the shift in his tone. She knew exactly what was coming next. "What are your orders, Vance?" she asked. "I want a federal freeze on every single account associated with the Sterling Trust," Vance commanded. "I want the discretionary funds locked down. I want the offshore routing numbers flagged by the Securities and Exchange Commission." "Vance," Beatrice warned, her voice tight with caution. If I initiate a federal injunction, it will trigger alarms across Wall Street. Montgomery will know we are coming for him the second the banks open. Let him know, Vance said. If he realizes the secret is out before the government processes the freeze, he will move the money, Beatrice said. He will wire it to non-extradition jurisdictions. He will burn the evidence. We are racing against the banking hours. Then you better work fast, Beatrice, Vance said. Because I am not giving him a single inch of breathing room. I will wake up a federal judge, Beatrice said, the thrill of the hunt finally bleeding into her voice. Where are you going now? I am going to secure my family, Vance said. He ended the call. He pressed the ignition button, and the heavy engine of the SUV roared to life, shattering the silence of the estate. He drove down the winding gravel path, the headlights cutting through the thick, freezing fog rolling off the ocean. He passed through the wrought iron gates and turned onto the coastal highway, leaving the Gilded Age mansions behind. The drive down the hill into the service town felt like crossing an invisible border. The pristine, manicured lawns gave way to cracked sidewalks, flickering street lamps, and tightly packed, weathered houses. This was the Blackwood Bay that the ultra-rich never saw. This was the world Harper had been forced to navigate alone. Vance navigated the narrow streets, his mind replaying the conversation with Beatrice. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Montgomery had treated Leo's existence as a mere information flow problem to be suppressed. He had paid Silas to manage the problem. Vance pulled onto a quiet, tree-lined street and spotted the small, weathered house Harper had described. A single reading light glowed in the front window. He parked the SUV at the curb and killed the engine. He sat in the dark for a moment, feeling the heavy metallic weight of the photograph in his coat pocket. He took a deep breath, forcing the violent rage down into a cold, tightly coiled spring. He could not afford to lose control. Not now. He stepped out of the car and walked up the wooden steps of the porch. He did not knock. He simply stood in front of the heavy oak door, waiting. 10 seconds later, the deadbolt clicked. The door opened a few inches, held in place by a thick brass chain. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a severe knot stared out at him. Her eyes were sharp, discerning, and completely devoid of fear. You must be the billionaire, Clara said, her voice a dry, pragmatic rasp. I am Vance Sterling, he replied, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. I am looking for Harper. Clara studied his face. She looked at his expensive overcoat, his polished shoes, and the deep, exhausted shadows under his eyes. She was a former constitutional law professor. She had spent her career analyzing the behavior of powerful people. She was looking for arrogance. She was looking for entitlement. She did not find either. She only found a man standing on the edge of a precipice. Clara unhooked the brass chain and opened the door. Wipe your feet, she said. The floors are clean. Vance stepped into the narrow hallway. The house smelled of peppermint tea, old paperbacks, and radiator heat. It was small, cramped, and infinitely warmer than the monolithic stone mansion he had just left. Harper was standing at the end of the hallway, near the entrance to the kitchen. She was still wearing her heavy wool coat, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and lingering terror. The professional armor she wore at the cliffside resort was completely gone. She looked like a woman who had been running for 9 years and had finally hit a wall. Vance stopped a few feet away from her. He did not try to touch her. He respected the boundary she had drawn in the diner. Where is he? Vance asked, his voice dropping to a soft, careful whisper. He is asleep in the guest room, Harper said, her coastal cadence trembling slightly. Clara gave him a book on bridge engineering. He read it until he passed out. Vance felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. A book on bridge engineering. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have read at 8 years old, hiding in the vast, empty library of the Sterling estate. Did Silas follow you? Vance asked, shifting his focus back to the immediate threat. No, Harper said, shaking her head. I made sure. I took the back roads. Vance nodded. He looked at Clara, who was standing by the front door, watching the exchange with a critical eye. I need to speak with her, Vance said to the older woman. Clara crossed her arms over her thick cardigan. You can speak to her in the kitchen, Clara said. I will sit in the living room. If you raise your voice, Mr. Sterling, I will ask you to leave, and I do not care how much money you have. I understand, Vance said, and he meant it. He respected Clara instantly. She was the protector Harper had needed when Vance was not there. Harper turned and walked into the small, brightly lit kitchen. Vance followed her. The room was dominated by a scarred wooden table and a humming refrigerator. Harper leaned against the counter, gripping the edge with white knuckles. "Tell me what is happening," she demanded. "Tell me why your estate manager was waiting by my car in the dark." Vance stood on the opposite side of the kitchen. He took a slow, measured breath. He knew that what he was about to say would shatter whatever remaining illusions Harper had about the safety of her world. "It was not just Silas," Vance said, his voice steady and clinical. "Silas was the mechanism, but he was not the architect." Harper frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked. Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the manila folder he had taken from the basement. He placed it on the wooden table and slid it across to her. Harper looked down. She saw the yellowed envelopes. She saw her own handwriting. And then, she saw the photograph of Leo, with the terrifying, bureaucratic label typed beneath it, "Retained for future disposition." Harper let out a sharp, ragged gasp. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears of pure, unadulterated horror. "They kept it," she whispered, her voice breaking. They looked at his face, and they just filed him away. "I am so sorry, Harper," Vance said, the gravelly undertone of his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "I would have burned the world down to find you if I had known. You have to believe that." Harper looked up at him. The anger in her eyes was entirely eclipsed by a profound, sickening realization. "Why?" she asked. "Why would they do this? What possible reason could they have to erase a child?" "Money," Vance said. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He explained the mechanics of the Sterling Trust. He explained the discretionary funds, the succession clause, and the mandatory federal audit. He explained how Fenwick Montgomery, a man who sat in a glass office high above Wall Street, had orchestrated the entire conspiracy simply to protect his own embezzlement scheme. "He paid Silas $40,000 a year to keep me isolated," Vance said. "To intercept my mail, to manage my relationships, to ensure that I never produced an heir that would trigger an investigation into the accounts." Harper stared at him, her mind struggling to process the sheer, sociopathic scale of the crime. "They stole 9 years of our lives," Harper said, her voice dropping to a hollow, devastated whisper. "I worked double shifts. I bought expired food. I cried myself to sleep because I thought I was a failure as a mother. And they did it to hide stolen money." Vance stepped forward. He closed the distance between them, stopping just inches away. He looked down into her eyes, letting her see the absolute, cold-blooded determination burning behind his corporate mask. "It ends tonight," Vance said. Harper looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "How?" she asked. "My attorney is waking up a federal judge right now," Vance said. "We are filing an emergency injunction to freeze every single asset connected to the Sterling Trust. We are locking Montgomery out of the accounts before he can move the stolen capital offshore." Harper shook her head, the panic rising again. "If you corner a man like that, he will fight back," she said. "He will use the trust's lawyers. He will come after Leo. He will not have the time," Vance promised, his voice a lethal, unyielding weapon. "By the time the sun comes up, the federal marshals will be tearing his life apart. I am going to dismantle his empire piece by piece. And when I am finished, there will be nothing left of Fenwick Montgomery but a reference number in a federal prison." Harper stared at him. She saw the ruthless venture capitalist, the man who destroyed corporations for a living. But for the first time, she was glad he was a monster. Because he was their monster now. "I am staying here tonight," Vance said, his tone shifting from a promise of destruction to a quiet, protective vow. "I will sit in the hallway. I will not sleep. No one is coming through that door." Harper looked at him for a long moment. The heavy iron armor she had worn for 8 years finally cracked, falling away in jagged pieces. She gave a slow, exhausted nod. "Okay," she whispered. The psychological weight of the night settled over the small house like a heavy blanket. Clara retired to her bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. Harper went into the guest room, curling up on the edge of the bed next to her sleeping son. Vance remained in the dark. He sat in a worn armchair in the corner of the living room, facing the front door. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, and the distant, muffled roar of the Atlantic Ocean crashing against the cliffs. He did not turn on a light. He did not look at his phone. He simply sat in the shadows, letting the silence press against him. He thought about the fragile machinery of human lives. He thought about how easily a life could be derailed by a single intercepted letter. He thought about the sheer arrogance of men who believed they could manage human beings like line items on a balance sheet. He listened to the soft, even breathing coming from the guest room. His son, the word echoed in his mind, carrying a weight he had never known. He had spent his entire life accumulating wealth, building impenetrable corporate fortresses, and managing risk. But sitting in this cramped, weathered house, listening to the breathing of a child he had never met, Vance realized that he had been entirely hollow. He had owned the world, but he had possessed absolutely nothing of value. The hours dragged on. The temperature in the house dropped as the coastal wind battered the windows. Vance did not move. He remained perfectly still, a sentinel in the dark, guarding the only thing that mattered. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence was shattered. Vance's phone vibrated in his coat pocket. The sudden, violent buzzing felt like an electric shock in the quiet room. He pulled the device out. The screen illuminated his face with a harsh, blue light. The caller ID displayed a blocked number. Vance knew exactly who it was. He stood up, walking silently into the kitchen and closing the door behind him to avoid waking Harper and Leo. He stood by the sink, looking out the window at the freezing, pitch-black night. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He did not say a word. "Vance, my boy," a voice said. The voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with the effortless arrogance of old money. It was a voice that had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. It was a voice that had never known consequence. "Fenwick Montgomery. It is rather late for banking hours." "Fenwick," Vance said. His voice was a terrifying, gravelly whisper, completely devoid of the polite deference he had always shown the senior trustee. Montgomery chuckled, a dry, civilized sound that echoed through the phone. "Indeed it is," Montgomery replied. "I was just awakened by a rather frantic phone call from the compliance department at Chase Manhattan. It seems someone has filed an emergency federal injunction against the Sterling Trust's primary discretionary accounts." Vance stared out the window at the darkness. "That is correct," Vance said. Montgomery sighed, the sound conveying the weary patience of a father dealing with a petulant child. "Vance, this is highly irregular," Montgomery said, his tone perfectly modulated. "I understand you have been under a great deal of stress lately. Silas mentioned you were experiencing some personal difficulties. But freezing the accounts is a massive overreaction. It is an inconvenience that will cost the trust millions in stalled investments by morning." "An inconvenience," Vance repeated. The word tasted like poison. "Yes," Montgomery said smoothly. "Now, I am willing to overlook this lapse in judgment. I will have my legal team contact the judge and explain that this was a misunderstanding born of exhaustion. We will lift the freeze, and we can discuss whatever personal grievances you have with Silas in a civilized manner." Vance closed his eyes. He pictured the photograph of his 8-month-old son. He pictured the typed label. He pictured Harper, exhausted and terrified, standing in the freezing parking lot. "You embezzled $38 million, Vance said. The silence on the line was absolute. The smooth, cultured arrogance vanished instantly. For 5 seconds, neither man breathed. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in Clara's kitchen. When Montgomery finally spoke, his voice had dropped an octave. The polite mask was gone. The Wall Street aristocrat had been replaced by a cornered predator. "You are stepping into waters you do not understand, Vance," Montgomery said, his words slow and lethal. "The Sterling Trust is a very delicate ecosystem. If you attempt to tear it apart, you will destroy your own legacy. You will ruin your family's name. My family is sleeping in the next room," Vance said, his voice vibrating with a cold, absolute promise of violence. Another heavy silence fell over the line. Montgomery was processing the information, calculating the variables, realizing that the secret he had paid so much to bury had finally clawed its way out of the ground. "Listen to me very carefully, Fenwick," Vance said, his corporate dialect returning, sharp, precise, and utterly merciless. "You are not going to negotiate. You are not going to call your lawyers. You are going to sit in your penthouse, and you are going to wait for the sun to come up." "Vance, be reasonable," Montgomery attempted, a faint trace of panic finally bleeding into his voice. "We can come to an arrangement. A financial settlement. I do not want your money," Vance whispered. "I want your life. I want you to watch everything you have built burn to ash. I want you to feel the exact same terror you forced upon a young mother for 9 years." He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, his knuckles white. "The federal freeze holds," Vance said. "The accounts are locked. The offshore routing numbers have been handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. By dawn, the marshals will be at your door. You cannot prove I knew about the child," Montgomery spat, his composure finally shattering. "Silas acted alone. Silas kept ledgers," Vance replied softly. He documented every shadow payment you made to him. He kept the receipts, Fenwick, because men like Silas always build a lifeboat out of their master's sins. A sharp, ragged intake of breath echoed through the phone. Montgomery realized he was trapped. The impenetrable fortress of his wealth had just become a tomb. "Enjoy your final hours of freedom, Fenwick," Vance said. He ended the call. He placed the phone on the counter and leaned heavily against the sink. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a violent, rhythmic pounding that matched the crashing of the ocean outside. He had done it. He had pulled the trigger. The quiet, invisible war that had dictated his life for a decade was over. He walked back into the living room and sat down in the worn armchair. He looked toward the guest room door, knowing that the people inside were finally safe from the shadows. Hours passed. The grandfather clock ticked away the final moments of the night. Slowly, the pitch-black sky outside the window began to turn a bruised slate gray. The wind died down, leaving a heavy, expectant stillness over Blackwood Bay. Dawn broke over the Atlantic. The pale, freezing light crept through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It cast long shadows across the small living room, touching the edge of the armchair where Vance sat. Wide awake, his eyes fixed on the door, his phone vibrated once. A single text message from Beatrice. "The injunction is signed. The freeze is absolute. The marshals are moving." Vance locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders for the first time in 9 years. The shadows had been stripped away. The corporate machine that had tried to erase his son was currently being dismantled by the federal government. The quiet war was over. The loud, brutal public war was about to begin. His phone vibrated once. A single text message from Beatrice. "The injunction is signed. The freeze is absolute. The marshals are moving." Vance locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders for the first time in 9 years. The shadows had been stripped away. The corporate machine that had tried to erase his son was currently being dismantled by the federal government. The quiet war was over. The loud, brutal public war was about to begin. 200 miles away, in the heart of the financial district, the sun had not yet crested the towering glass skyscrapers of Manhattan. The streets were empty, save for the delivery trucks and the early morning sanitation crews. But outside the monolithic headquarters of the Sterling Trust, a fleet of black, unmarked government vehicles pulled silently up to the curb. Dozens of federal agents stepped out onto the pavement. They wore dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back. They did not stop at the security desk. They did not ask for permission. They moved with the synchronized, devastating precision of a system that had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. They breached the executive elevators. They bypassed the polished receptionists. They walked directly into the glass-walled office of Fenwick Montgomery. At the exact same moment, in the freezing, salt-heavy air of Rhode Island, a second team of federal marshals drove their heavy SUVs through the wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate. They did not bother to ring the bell of the carriage house. They shattered the heavy wooden door of Silas's private residence. They found the impeccable, silver-haired estate manager sitting in his leather armchair, fully dressed in a bespoke suit, staring blankly at the wall. Silas did not resist. He simply closed his eyes as the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. He knew the ledgers were gone. He knew the architect of his ruin was the very boy he had tried to manage. Back in the small, weathered house in Blackwood Bay, the morning arrived with a quiet, fragile peace. Vance remained in the worn armchair in Clara's living room. He listened to the sounds of the house waking up. He heard the soft creak of the floorboards, the hum of the old plumbing, and the low, pragmatic voice of Clara in the kitchen. Harper walked into the living room. She was wearing a thick, oversized sweater, her dark hair pulled back loosely. The exhaustion was still etched deeply into the lines of her face, but the absolute, suffocating terror of the previous night was gone. She held 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. She walked over to Vance and handed him one. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. Her hands were warm. "It is on the news," Harper said, her voice a quiet, disbelieving whisper. Vance looked up at her. He took a slow sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. "What are they saying?" he asked. Harper sat down on the edge of the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest. "They are calling it the largest internal embezzlement scandal in Wall Street history," she said. "They are saying the senior trustee of the Sterling Trust has been arrested. They showed footage of federal agents carrying boxes of hard drives out of the estate." Vance nodded slowly. He felt no triumph. He felt no joy. He only felt a cold, heavy vindication. "It is over, Harper," Vance said softly. "They can never touch you again." Harper looked toward the hallway. Leo was standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his dark, unruly hair sticking up in every direction. He was wearing a pair of faded flannel pajamas. He looked at his mother. Then, he looked at the tall, imposing man sitting in the armchair. Leo did not hide behind his mother. He did not look afraid. He possessed that same sharp, analytical curiosity that Vance had recognized the moment the boy had crashed into him in the lobby of the Cliffside Resort. Leo walked slowly into the room. He stopped a few feet away from Vance, studying the man's face with intense concentration. "You are the man from the lobby," Leo said. His voice was clear, precise, and completely devoid of childhood hesitation. "I am," Vance replied, keeping his voice low and steady. "You look like me," Leo stated, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact of geometry and genetics. Vance felt a sudden, profound ache in his chest. He placed his coffee mug on the small wooden table beside him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to the boy's eye level. "I do," Vance said. Leo tilted his head, his piercing stare locking onto Vance's eyes. "Are you my father?" Leo asked. Harper held her breath. She gripped the edge of the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent 8 years preparing for 1,000 different disasters, but she had never prepared for the absolute, terrifying simplicity of this moment. Vance did not look away from the boy. He did not offer a corporate deflection. He did not use polite, bureaucratic language. "Yes," Vance said, "I am." Leo processed the information. He did not cry. He did not run. He simply nodded, as if a complex mathematical equation had finally been balanced. "Okay," Leo said. He turned and walked into the kitchen, following the smell of Clara's cooking. Vance let out a long, shuddering breath. He leaned back in the armchair, closing his eyes. The monolithic structure of his old life was completely gone, burned to ash by the federal government. But in its place, something entirely new, something terrifyingly fragile, had just begun to take root. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating to the old money elite of New England. The scale of the $38 million embezzlement was laid bare to the public. The financial news networks ran endless segments dissecting the labyrinth of subsidiary accounts, offshore shell companies, and shadow investments that Fenwick Montgomery had used to bleed the Sterling Trust dry. The pristine illusion of the wealthy was shattered. At the Cliffside Resort, the atmosphere turned to pure panic. The ultra-rich guests, terrified of being associated with a federal investigation, began canceling their reservations by the dozens. Fiona, the perpetually anxious assistant manager, paced the lobby in a state of near collapse, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Harper walked into the resort on a Tuesday morning. She was not wearing her uniform. She was wearing a simple, elegant wool coat. She walked directly to the front desk. She placed her security badge and her master keys on the polished marble counter. Fiona stared at her, her eyes wide with confusion. "Marin, what are you doing?" Fiona asked, her voice shrill. "We have 3 VIP arrivals today. I need you to manage the housekeeping staff." "My name is Harper," she said, her coastal cadence ringing with a quiet, unyielding dignity. "And I quit." She turned and walked out of the cavernous lobby, leaving the smell of expensive cedar and old money behind her forever. She walked down the sweeping stone steps, breathing in the freezing, salt-heavy air of the Atlantic. For the first time in 8 years, she did not feel like an invisible ghost. She felt entirely, completely alive. Behind the closed doors of the federal prosecutor's office, the legal destruction of Silas and Montgomery was a masterclass in ruthless efficiency. Beatrice, Vance's silver-haired attorney, coordinated with the government to ensure that neither man had a single inch of breathing room. "There is no honor among thieves," Beatrice told Vance during a late-night phone call. "Especially not among wealthy ones." She was right. The moment the federal freeze locked them out of their offshore accounts, Silas and Montgomery turned on each other with the vicious, desperate panic of drowning men. Montgomery attempted to frame Silas as a rogue employee, claiming the estate manager had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme without his knowledge. He hired a team of expensive defense attorneys to paint Silas as a manipulative sociopath who had taken advantage of the trust's blind spots. But Silas believed that documentation was protection. The impeccable estate manager handed over every single handwritten ledger to the federal prosecutors. He provided the exact dates, the routing numbers, and the recorded phone calls proving that Montgomery had authorized every shadow payment. Silas offered the government the entire $38 million conspiracy on a silver platter, begging for a plea deal to avoid dying in a federal penitentiary. The government took the ledgers. They used them to completely dismantle Montgomery's defense. And then, they denied Silas the plea deal. They charged both men with federal wire fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and a dozen other financial crimes. The corporate machine that had treated human lives as liabilities was finally crushed under the weight of its own arrogance. 11 months later, the bitter winter had returned to Rhode Island, bringing with it the heavy slate-gray skies and the relentless coastal winds. Inside the federal courthouse in Boston, the air was warm, smelling of polished mahogany and old paper. The courtroom was packed with journalists, financial analysts, and the curious public, all eager to witness the final chapter of the Sterling Trust scandal. Vance sat in the front row of the gallery. He wore a dark, tailored suit, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask of quiet authority. He watched as the bailiff led the defendants into the room. Fenwick Montgomery looked nothing like the untouchable Wall Street aristocrat he had once been. He had lost weight. His skin was pale and papery. The bespoke suits had been replaced by the drab, shapeless uniform of a federal inmate. He shuffled toward the defense table, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, unable to look at the gallery. Warren Silas followed closely behind him. The silver-haired fixer was completely hollowed out. The polite, bureaucratic arrogance was gone. He looked like a fragile, terrified old man who had finally realized that his ledgers could not save his soul. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero patience for corporate entitlement, delivered the sentencing. She spoke of the profound breach of trust. She spoke of the arrogance of wealth. She spoke of the $38 million stolen from a generational legacy. She sentenced Fenwick Montgomery to 22 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. She sentenced Warren Silas to 15 years. The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the heavy mahogany room like a gunshot. Vance did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom. He walked down the wide marble steps of the courthouse and stepped out into the freezing Boston air. He looked up at the gray sky. The men who had reduced his son to a reference number were gone. They would die in concrete cells, stripped of their names, their wealth, and their power. The ledger was finally balanced. The slow, delicate rebuilding of a family did not happen overnight. It was not a cinematic montage of sudden perfection. It was a careful, unhurried process of earning trust, establishing boundaries, and healing the deep, invisible wounds of the past decade. Vance did not force his way into Harper and Leo's lives. He knew that his wealth was a weapon, and he refused to use it against the people he loved. He did not buy them a Gilded Age mansion on the cliffs. He did not surround them with security details or private tutors. He understood that Harper had survived by relying on her own pragmatic strength, and to strip that away from her would be another form of erasure. Instead, Vance bought a modest, beautiful, historic home in the quietest part of Blackwood Bay. It had a wraparound porch, a large yard, and a clear view of the ocean. It was a home, not a museum. He also funded a massive, irrevocable endowment to establish a coastal charity for single mothers in Rhode Island. He placed the entire organization under Harper's absolute control. Harper took the position with the fierce, quiet fire that defined her. She transformed the charity into a lifeline for the working-class women of the service town. She provided legal assistance, childcare grants, and housing support for the invisible ghosts who maintained the illusion of the wealthy. She dictated the terms of her own life, building a legacy of protection rather than exploitation. Vance's relationship with Leo grew in the quiet, observant spaces between them. They did not have explosive, emotional breakthroughs. They bonded over the precise, analytical mechanics of the world. Vance spent his weekends sitting on the floor of Leo's new bedroom, helping the boy construct intricate model airplanes. They discussed the principles of lift, drag, and thrust. They debated the structural integrity of suspension bridges. Vance listened to his son with the same profound, quiet respect that Jasper the groundskeeper had shown the boy at the resort. Vance learned how to be a father, not by commanding the room, but by simply being present in it. He learned to answer the endless stream of questions. He learned to recognize the exact moment Leo's piercing stare softened into genuine affection. And slowly, carefully, the ice around Vance's heart completely melted away. On a Tuesday evening in late January, Vance and Harper met for dinner. They did not go to a hyper-exclusive, ultra-luxury restaurant. They went to a quiet, dimly lit seafood tavern on the edge of the docks in Blackwood Bay. The wooden floors were scuffed by decades of fishermen's boots. The air smelled of fried clams, dark stout, and the heavy, damp scent of the harbor. They sat in a corner booth, a single flickering candle illuminating the space between them. Harper was wearing a soft, dark green sweater. The deep exhaustion that had haunted her eyes for 8 years was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a grounded, peaceful clarity. Vance wore a simple dark shirt, his corporate mask entirely discarded. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, marveling at her resilience. She had fought a war against an invisible empire, and she had won. Harper took a sip of her wine. She traced the rim of the glass with her finger, her eyes focused on the flickering flame of the candle. "I am tired, Vance," she said softly. Her coastal cadence was stripped of all its defensive armor. Vance nodded, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "You have every right to be," he said. "You carried the weight of the world for 9 years. You carried it alone." Harper looked up, meeting his gaze. "I do not want to fight anymore," she said. "I do not want to calculate every expense. I do not want to look over my shoulder. I just want to see who we are when the sky is not falling." Vance reached across the scarred wooden table. He did not grab her hand. He simply rested his palm on the table, leaving the choice entirely up to her. "Then let the sky stay exactly where it is," Vance said. "We have all the time in the world now, Harper. We do not have to rush. We do not have to prove anything to anyone. We just get to live." Harper looked at his hand. She slowly reached out, her fingers sliding over his, her palm resting against his skin. The warmth of the contact sent a quiet, profound tremor through both of them. It was the first time they had touched without the shadow of a crisis hanging over them. It felt like coming home. "I would like that," Harper whispered. The climax of their long, agonizing journey did not happen in a courtroom, or a boardroom, or a Gilded Age mansion. It happened on a rugged, public stretch of Rhode Island beach in the dead of winter. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, completely devoid of clouds. The wind was biting, whipping off the slate-gray Atlantic with a fierce, cleansing energy. The sand was frozen solid, crunching beneath their boots like crushed glass. Leo was running 20 yards ahead of them. He was wearing a bright red winter jacket, a vivid, undeniable splash of color against the stark, monochromatic landscape. He was completely in his element, his forward momentum carrying him over the frozen dunes. He stopped near the water's edge, picking up a heavy piece of silver driftwood. He calculated the angle of the wind, shifted his weight, and hurled the wood into the crashing, freezing surf. Vance and Harper walked side by side, following his path. They were wrapped in heavy wool coats, their scarves pulled tight against the cold. They did not speak. The roar of the ocean filled the silence, a massive, rhythmic sound that drowned out the echoes of the past. Vance watched his son running along the shoreline. He thought about the manila folder in the dark basement. He thought about the typed label, the stolen years, and the cold, clinical way his family's empire had tried to erase this beautiful, brilliant boy. The empire was gone. The boy remained. Harper stepped closer to Vance to avoid a patch of jagged ice. As she moved, the physical distance between them finally closed. Their shoulders brushed. It was a small, simple point of contact, but it carried the weight of a decade of longing, survival, and ultimate vindication. Harper did not pull away. She leaned into the contact, her shoulder resting firmly against his arm, grounding herself in his quiet, unyielding presence. Vance looked down at her. He saw the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. He saw the fierce, quiet fire in her eyes, now burning not with desperation, but with a deep, resonant hope. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer against the biting wind. They stood together on the edge of the continent, watching the boy in the bright red jacket throw stones into the sea. They had survived the storm. They had reclaimed their stolen time. And as the freezing Atlantic crashed against the jagged rocks of Blackwood Bay, they finally began the quiet, triumphant work of building a life entirely on their own terms.